Hello, welcome back to part two of this series of films in which I'm discussing genealogy and family history and trying to uh, show you how to trace your own family tree by using my family as an example. So in part one, I showed you the basic mechanism of searching for alternating birth certificates and marriage certificates and slowly going back in time and building your tree up that way. And at the end of part one, we had reached the stage where I didn't have many names on my tree, and I was at the point where I was about to search for my grandfather's birth certificate, and I knew from a combination of available censuses and certificates that I'd already acquired that he was born in 1885, because I had his age from his marriage certificate and from the 1911 census, and I knew that his father's name was James, and I knew that from his marriage certificate, and I also knew as an added bonus that his mother's name was Ellen, because I had got that from the 1911 census as well. She was living with him as a widow in 1911 with his family. So I'm going to assume that you now know the basic mechanism and are familiar with this particular website that I use, Find My Past, and you understand the principles of the volume and page numbers and how to order the certificates. And I'll just show you the process. I type in Richard Astley, and I know he's born in around 1885, and I know also from the census that he was born in Wolverhampton, and I know as well his mother's Christian name, so I've got a lot to go on. And sure enough, there is only one Richard Astley that matches all those criteria, and I can obtain the information I need in order to order the certificate, the volume number, page number and so on, and the district being Wolverhampton. And I obtain the birth certificate and it looks like this. And immediately from it I now have Ellen's maiden name. It was Gough, and I have the address that they were living at, which is in Green Lane in Wolverhampton. And what draws my eye as well is that on Richard's marriage certificate he put down his father's occupation as miner, but at this point when he's born, his father is working as an iron scaler, and it took me a little bit of research to find out what that was, but basically there was a very large iron industry in Wolverhampton, and an iron scaler was the person who had the rather unpleasant and arduous task of cleaning out the furnaces, basically scaling them, descaling them of the iron deposit on the sides of the furnaces after the iron had been cast, and it was very unpleasant work by all accounts. Now I am pretending for the purposes of this exercise that I'm doing all this research and inquiry in 2015 and using websites to do it, but no doubt you've noticed all these certificates are dated 1980, which is the year that I actually purchased them, and obviously 35 years have gone by since then, and in that time I've found out a great deal more information than I had then. And in particular, I found out a great deal about the Goths because they were a very large family, and there are lots of their descendants who, fortunately for me, are very keen researchers of their own family. And I'll probably have to come back to the story of the Goths in a in another episode, but that was of great advantage to me, that I was able to contact a lot of these people. If you remember back in episode 1, I also mentioned the website Genes Reunited, and I was able to find a great many matches with other people's family trees on that website. So I'll come back to the Goths in another episode. And in another episode coming up soon, I'm also going to talk about other websites and other means at your disposal to flesh out your research. And one thing in particular that I love doing is purchasing maps of the period. And from those, I have since learnt that Green Lane, which sounds like a lovely idyllic lane on the edges of the town, maybe leading out into a nice bit of green countryside, is actually one of the main roads leading south out of Wolverhampton towards Birmingham, and it's been renamed long since Birmingham Street, which makes it sound a little bit more prosaic, really. And it wasn't a particularly pleasant place to live in the 19th century. Okay, so I'm back to that process. I've got a birth certificate. I next want to obtain a marriage certificate, that being the marriage certificate of James Astley and Ellen Goff. So I go back to find my past, and I make a search as follows. So I'm looking under marriages, I put both their names in, click search, and I get this result. There are no matches, and that's slightly distressing because I had all the details that I needed. I knew both their names, and I had a rough idea when they would have been married. So something's gone awry, and bearing in mind the story I told you last week about the first child of Richard and Esther being born before the couple got married, I did wonder whether something similar had happened between James and Ellen. And remember, this is 1980 as well, so my only recourse is to look under different spellings of the name, see if I can find anything, go forward in time as well as backward, and plough my way through all these heavy volumes. And it brought no results. Remember as well that the censuses that would have helped me enormously weren't available in 1980. They're only released after 100 years to ensure that the privacy of the people that are named on them is preserved. And so in 1980 I would have had the 1871 census available, but not the crucial 1881 census or any of the others. So I'd had none of this information at the time. So after a long and time-consuming search, where I spent a great many of my lunch hours sat in Catherine House desperately trying to find this marriage certificate and failing, I had to assume that James and Ellen never got married, and that left me with a problem, because my only chance was then to find the birth certificate of James Astley without knowing his age, because remember, I didn't have any census records either, so I couldn't find him cohabiting with Ellen on a census, find his age, and then find his birth certificate. And as it happened, there were two James Astleys who were born in Wolverhampton, who both might have fitted the bill. They were both born in 1859, and I had absolutely no way of knowing which one to choose. So the trail had temporarily gone cold, But bringing you back up to date, 2015, I'll show you how life is so much easier now and how simple that was to solve. Okay, so I'm sure you're going to find similar problems yourselves when you start researching your tree. And the first thing to do is you'll notice under the last name there's an option to tick for variants. And basically what that does is the equivalent of what I had to do mechanically back in 1980, is it searches for all the names that look and sound vaguely like Astley. So it goes to the indices and it looks for Astleys and Attleys and Adleys and all that kind of thing, and searches for those. And this search still didn't throw up any matches, so it sort of confirmed my suspicions that I had exhausted the search back in 1980 and had done it thoroughly enough, and there wasn't a certificate to find. But then I tried something else just on an off chance, and that is known as a wildcard, and this is a really useful tip. So if you look under the last name now, what I've done is placed an asterisk before the letters LEY. So what the software is now going to do is search through all the names and try and match a James something Lee up against an Ellen Goff. And if you imagine me trying to do that back in 1980, I would have had to look through every single name in the archive, because I wouldn't have known the starting letter of the surname. So I would have had to have gone through everything just looking for any name that happened to end in LEY. But nowadays software can do that in a split second, and it's a really interesting aspect of the way that computerization has really aided historical research. And hey presto, there's immediately 4 results. Now, in fact, there's 4 lines there, but there are actually only 2 people involved here. One person is called James Bradley, and the other person is called James Hasley. And the reason that each person has 2 lines is that the website, Find My Past, doesn't only contain a database of the registration process, it also contains a database of church records. And both of these 2 Jameses were married in a church, and the church as well has its own copy of the marriage details. So it's just as easy on this website. Obviously I couldn't have found the church record in the state-run Catherine House that I was visiting, but you've got far more bites of the apple, as it were, by using genealogical websites. So I'm immediately drawn towards James Hasley because he was married in Wolverhampton rather than the James Bradley who was married somewhere else, Staffordshire or somewhere. So I'm going to look at the church record of James Hasley, and I'll show you why in a moment. So what I'm given is a photograph of the entry in the church records. So had I gone the other route and looked up the registration process, all I would have got would have been the district and the volume and page number, and I would then have had to have applied to the register office, the General Register Office, to purchase a certificate that would have looked no different from this photograph. So it's immediately saved me £9, and it's got all the information on it. And also you'll notice I was correcting what I said in the previous episode, that they always have two weddings on one page, which is why you always get this doubling up of spouses. You'll get James Astley either married Ellen Goff or whoever the other bride on the page is. So that explains that mystery from the episode 1. Now the mystery is solved. If you look down at the signatures of James and Ellen, neither of them could write. They're both put across as their mark, and the whoever the official was at the wedding just misheard James's name and thought there was an H in it. Maybe he was a bit breathless, trepidation at marrying his bride. And Astley wasn't considered to be a name variant when the software checked for it, but the wild card came up trumps. So I'm back on the trail again now. I now have the ages of both James and Ellen, and I also have the name of James's father, which was also James. So I now know that my great grandfather was called James Astley. They've misspelt it there. And his profession was a key finisher. And that's something else that I found out with later research, is that as well as there being a big iron industry in Wolverhampton, it's also the home of Chubbs, the famous lock and key maker. And I'm sure James probably worked at Chubbs. And we can stay on this page for a little bit longer as well, because there's other things of interest on it. Notice the date that they got married on, December the 26th, 1881, so it's Boxing Day. And that is, again, very common with working class families. I've got a lot of examples of that on my family tree, of couples who marry either on Christmas Day itself or on Boxing Day. There's probably a number of reasons. One is that there were no holidays in those days for men and women working in factories, so they had to rely on the sort of religious holidays. And you get the impression that the churches almost had a factory process on Boxing Day, where they married so many couples. But another thing that happens as a result of that is that you frequently get families, say pairs or even trios of sisters or brothers, all marrying at the same place at the same time. So on this page, it has happened to me. It's not happened in this case, that you'll find that there's another member of your family getting married on the line below. And although I don't recognise the names of the couple below, it is interesting to note that they all live in the same road, Dudley Road in Wolverhampton. So maybe they did say, let's all go off and get married today, and those two couples knew one another. And another thing to point out, which is something that I mentioned in episode 1, is it's always worth looking at the names of the witnesses, because sometimes churches had people who acted as paid officiants, but very often you get other members of the family witnessing the ceremony, and in this case it's a George and Eliza Goff. So that gives you a pointer to the names of other people in the family. George clearly isn't Ellen's father, because it's got down the name Richard Goff as the father, but he may be her brother, and Eliza could either be her sister or her sister-in-law. So it gives you a little pointer about directions to search in for other members' names to put on your family tree. Now, obviously this discovery opens up a whole new avenue of research, because I can now take my family tree back further, but I kind of want to take a step back at this stage, because we're now talking about things that I found out 20 years after my first attempt. So I want to kind of like retrace my steps a little bit, because in that intervening 20 years I wasn't idle. I used sort of similar techniques to what I've been showing you to flesh out the family tree up until James Astley and Ellen Goff, or rather, yeah, up until them. And I can't show you everything because it would just, I have so much, but one thing I thought you might be particularly interested in, this is an interesting story, is that I happen to know what, I mean, my father, I had nothing from my mother in terms of family background, but my dad had little snippets, and one thing that always interested me, that I picked up on from things he said, was that he had an uncle who had served in the Boer War, and this uncle had died in an accident a couple of years before my father was actually born. So my father had only heard him spoken of. He had never actually met this person, but he knew that his name was Robert. So my father had an uncle called Robert, and that was something that I could track, particularly as he had this interesting story of military service and some kind of terrible accident where he met his end. Okay, so it wasn't too difficult for me to find his birth certificate. Here it is. Robert Astley, father's name James Astley, and mother's name Ellen Astley, formerly Goff. So I don't gain any more information from that other than I knew from my grandfather's birth certificate. The only things I can see are that he was born 2 years before my grandfather, so he's the eldest son of the couple, so that might have narrowed my search for their wedding certificate, but it wouldn't have helped in the final event. And the address is different. That's nothing special really about that. They're living in Pountney Street at this point, and that's about it really. But I now have his date of birth, so I'm going to search for his death certificate. This is the first time on this series of films that I'll show you a death certificate, but you look for them in exactly the same way. So I'm looking for a death certificate sometime between 1901, when he returned from the Boer War, and 1912, when my father was born. I know he died sometime in that period. And here it is. It makes sorry reading. Robert Astley died when he was 27 years old in 1910, and the cause of his death was shock and blood loss from an amputation of his arm, which was necessitated by an accident that happened in the railway sidings of a colliery. So he wasn't a railway worker, he was a mine worker working on the colliery's railway, and he fell from one of the trucks and fell under the wheels of the train, and suffered such serious injuries to his arm that a doctor was obliged to amputate his arm. But if you notice, this is in a cottage hospital, not in a large hospital. This is long before the days of the NHS and long before any kind of state help in even in cases of dire need like this. So probably if someone had an accident of that sort nowadays, they would survive. Obviously, they would have lost their arm, but it took him over 24 hours to die, and he basically died of shock and blood loss rather than from the injury itself. And that's something that wouldn't happen in today's NHS. Now, this does, however, give me the opportunity to demonstrate another aspect of researching your family history that goes beyond this process of digging out certificates and censuses. That once you find something like this, once you find an unusual occupation or a strange incident or accident that happens in someone's life, then you can pursue it, and something like that is bound to be in the local newspapers. And so I wrote to the library in St Helens, and they very kindly went through their microfiches of newspapers in that week and sent me back this copy of the report in the local newspaper of the inquest. So it embellishes the story a little bit. The text is probably a little bit too small for you to read, I'm sorry, but it also gives me a little bit more detail about Robert Astley's circumstances. It says that he leaves a widow and 2 children, so that's something that I can pursue. I can see if he has any descendants, may even have living descendants who I can contact. It gets his name wrong. It calls him Joseph Astley, but I'd be very surprised if that wasn't Robert Astley. There can't be 2 people in the same week who both lose their arms in accidents of that kind. And it confirms as well, I didn't point out on the death certificate, that he's actually living at number 9 Gibraltar Cottages, which is next door to where my father was born. Now, I know again from my father's account, but it wouldn't be immediately obvious, is that Gibraltar Cottages were a very short terrace of cottages, and they didn't have a particularly good reputation. They were quite a tough bunch of families who lived there, and Gibraltar Cottages was renamed several times simply because it had a bad reputation. But something else I would encourage you to do with your family research is to get hold of old maps and try and find out where these places are. I've never been able to accurately locate where Gibraltar Cottages are, but that's mainly because this whole area is just a complete warren and mess of railways, canals, cuttings, streets, factories, and that's partly the reason why they had trouble with their nomenclature, as it were, and describe places as Newton le Macclesfield, as I showed you last time. And other than that, it does, the actual report of the inquest does enrage you. There was no talk of compensation for the widow and her family. It's basically, the blame was placed on Robert for trying to leap from one wagon to another, ignoring the safety notices that the owner of the colliery was sure to point out he'd placed on the wagons. So he claimed no responsibility for the accident whatsoever, and that put the family into great distress. And I was also able to find out a little bit about his military service in the Boer War. He was a private in the King's Own Royal Regiment, which was the same regiment as my father was later to join in 1932. And the King's Own was a very senior regiment. It was the 4th Regiment of Foot, so I think there were 2 Guards regiments, and then the 3rd Regiment was the Buffs, and then the King's Own was the 4th Regiment. So it dates back to King Charles II. And Robert served as a private, and he received a slight wound at a minor battle at a place called Itala Fort, which was a mission in Zululand in Natal province, and that was attacked by the Boer commander Bertha in September 1901, and Robert had a light wound, a scratch of some kind. So other than that, I wasn't able to find out very much about his Boer War activities. But it did give me the opportunity to track some other members of his family, as I say. So in this intervening period where I couldn't get past the problem and not being able to find the marriage certificate of James Astley and Ellen Goff, I also found out quite a lot more sideways, as it were, and back down. And as you can see from here, I've found the names of quite a lot of children that were members of James and Ellen's family, not just my grandfather Richard and this chap Robert. There was also a girl called Ellen who died very young, and then a girl called Alice who lived to ripe old age, so she was an aunt of my father. She married someone called William Jones, so unfortunately that makes her family very difficult to trace. There were so many Joneses in there, but I did find out quite a bit about them, nevertheless. And then there was a boy called James Astley, and he died when he was about 7 years old of meningitis. And if you notice, he died on the 20th of May 1903, and he had a sister who was born a week earlier. So poor Ellen must have really had her hands full at that stage. She had a week-old baby and another child who died in the same house. So life was just very cruel in those days, as well as, you know, later that decade, all the problem next door with her her daughter-in-law being widowed and leaving grandchildren of hers orphaned in the house next door. So it just must have been absolutely terrible. But I'm going to leave it there. That one other thing that I kind of am intrigued by, that I suppose I'll mention just to tell you that I got nowhere with it, was that I found the 1901 census, and I can find Ellen and her family, and they've moved back to Wolverhampton temporarily, because the family moved from Wolverhampton to Lancashire during this period, and there is no sign of Robert, and that's clearly because he's in South Africa, but there's also no sign of James. It's very tempting to think that he went out and fought in the Boer War as well, but I've never been able to find any record of his service, so where he was, I just don't know. But because I haven't been able to find him at all, if it hadn't been for the fact that I hadn't been able to find his marriage certificate, I would have just assumed that he was in South Africa, but it might be a case of his name being spelt differently, and he's working in Lancashire and left his family in Wolverhampton briefly. I don't know, but that intrigued me. But anyway, I'm going to leave it there, and In the next episode, I'm going to have a slight diversion and talk to you about useful websites that you can go to find out details that you may not necessarily think of going to. And then after that, I'll continue with the story of how I trace the Astley family back further. So until then, bye for now.